डॉक्टर बाबासाहेब आंबेडकर ओपन यूनिवर्सिटी.
Namaskar. I, Devarshi Modi from the School of Social Sciences and Humanities, welcome you all on our YouTube platform, BAOUGujarat. Friends, as currently we are looking at the study of a poetry paper from the TYBA syllabus and learning various poems. In the last video of this series of the My Last Duchess, we discussed about who was the writer of the poem, who was the poet of the poem, Robert Browning, the dramatic monologue. We got some idea about the Browning's style of writing. And today, we will be going to talk about My Last Duchess as a dramatic monologue. Not only that, we will also understand the connotative meanings, the figurative meaning, we'll discuss about the structure of the poem, we'll critically analyze the entire poem, and we will try to understand the words of the poem. So let us begin. Browning wrote this poem during the Victorian era, which encompassed the second half of the 19th century during the reign of the Queen Victoria in England. The Victorians were fascinated with the Italian Renaissance, including its poetic forms, music, architecture, and culture. The Renaissance, which extended from roughly 14th to the early 17th century, placed an emphasis on humanism, individualism, and the arts and the sciences, all of which particularly appealed to the Victorian society that was making scientific and artistic advances of its own time. The Renaissance also was a time when some elite and wealthy families, the aristocratic families, served as the patrons of the artist, supporting their favorites artist endeavors. In a way, the poem critiques such patrons as perhaps being more concerned with the social clout conferred by being associated with a certain artist than they were with the actual artwork itself. In other words, it suggests that some patrons just wanted to seem cool and influenced by the supporting artists but didn't actually appreciate their art. This very poem, My Last Duchess, focuses on a real historical patron of the arts, the Duke of Ferrara, also known as Alfonso II. The Duke of the Ferrara was an actual historical figure who lived in the Italy somewhere around 1500s. Like the speaker, Alfonso II had multiple wives, the first of which died very young, and after only few years of marriage, My Last Duchess is narrated by the Duke of Ferrara to an envoy that is representative of another nobleman whose daughter the Duke is soon to marry. These details are revealed throughout the poem, but understanding them from the opening helps to illustrate the irony that Brownings employ. So the opening line of the poem goes like this: "That's my last duchess painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive, I call." Friends, it's very important to keep in mind, again in the last video of the same series, I talked about this thing, that in this entire poem, the speaker talks or have a conversation with the painting rather than the real person. Because again, it's one of the characteristics of dramatic monologue. So Browning employs at the poet's opening, the Duke has just pulled back a curtain to reveal the envoy representative a portrait of his previous duchess. The portrait was painted by Fra Pandolf. Fra means monk. A monk or a painter whom the Duke believes captured the singularity of the Duchess's glance. However, The Duke insists to envoy that his former wife's deep, passionate glance was not reserved solely for her husband. As he puts it, she was too easily impressed into sharing her affable nature. His tone grows harsh as he recollects how both human and nature could impress her, which insulted him since she did not give special favor to the gift of his 900 years old family name and lineage. Refusing to design to lessen her on her unacceptable love of everything, he insisted and gave commands to have her killed. The Duke then ends his story and asks the envoy to rise and accompany him back to the Count, the father of the Duke's impending bride, and the envoy's employer. He mentions that he expects a high dowry, though he is happy enough with the daughter herself. He insists that the envoy walk with him together, a lapse of the unusual social expectation where the higher rank person would walk separately and on their descent. He points out a bronze bust of a god Neptune in his collection. My Last Duchess, the poem, is arguably Browning's most famous dramatic monologue. With a good reason, it engages the reader on a number of levels: historical, psychological, ironic, theatrical, and many more. The most engaging element of the poem is probably the speaker himself, the Duke. Objectively, it's easy to identify him as a monster since he had his wife murdered for what comes across as fairly innocent crime, for no crime. And yet, he is impressively charming, both in his use of language and his affable address. The ionic disconnect that colors most of Browning's monologue is particularly strong here. Remarkably, a moral man nevertheless has a lovely sense of beauty and of how to engage his listener. In fact, the Duke's excessive demand for control ultimately comes across as his most defining characteristics. The obvious manifestation of this is being murder of his wife. Her crime is barely presented as sexual, even though he does not admit that other men could draw her blood. He also mentions several natural phenomena that inspired her favor. And yet, he was driven to murder by her refusal to save her happy glances solely for him. This demand for control is also reflected in his relationship with the envoy. The entire poem has a precisely controlled theatrical flair. From the unveiling of the curtain that is implied to precede the opening to the way he slowly reveals the detail of his tale to his assuming of the envoy's interest in the tale, to his final shift in the subject back to the issue of the impending marriage. He pretends to denigrate his speaking ability, even had you skill in speech, which I have not, later revealing that he believes the opposite to be true, even at one point explicitly acknowledging how controlled his story is when he admits he said Fra Pandolf by design to pique the envoy's interest. then why is his audience much as we are Browning's? And the Duke exerts a similar control over his story that Browning uses in crafting the ironic disconnect. In terms of meter, Browning employed or represent the Duke's intense control of a story by using regular meter but also enjambment, where the phrases do not end at the close of the line. The enjambment works against the otherwise orderly meter to remind us that the Duke will control his world, including the rhyme scheme of his monologue. To some extent, the Duke's morality can be understood in terms of aristocracy. The poem was originally published with a companion poem under the title Italy and France, and both attempted to explore the ironies of aristocratic honors. In this poem, loosely inspired by real events set in the Renaissance Italy, the Duke reveals himself not only as a model of a culture but also as a monster of a morality. His inability to see his moral ugliness could be attributed to having been ruined by the worship of a 900 years old name. He is so entitled that when his wife upsets him by too loosely bestowing her favor to others, he refuses to speak to her about it. Such a move is out of the question. Who had stooped to blame this kind of trifling? He will not stoop to such ordinary domestic tasks as compromise or discussion. Instead, when she transgresses his sense of entitlement, he gives commands and she is dead. Another element of the aristocratic life that Browning approaches in the poem is that of the repetition. The Duke's life seems to be made of repeated gestures. The most obvious is his marriage. The use of the word last in the title implies that there are several others, perhaps with a curtain covered painting along the same hallway where this one stands. In the same way, the age of his name gives it credence, so does his seem fit with a life of repeated gestures, one of which he is ready to make again with the Count's daughter. And indeed, the question of money is revealed at the end in a way that colors the entire poem. The Duke almost employs his own sense of irony when he brings up dowry to the envoy. This final stanza suggests that his story of murder is meant to give proactive warning to the women he is soon to marry, but to give it a thorough, a back-to channel through the envoy who would pass it along to the Count, who might then pass it to the girl. After all, the Duke has no interest in talking to her himself, as we have learned. His irony goes even further when he reminds the envoy that he truly wants only the woman herself, even as he is clearly stressing the importance of a large dowry tinged with a threat of his vindicative side. But the lens of aristocracy undercuts the wonderful psychological nature of the poem, which is overall more concerned with the human contradictions than with the social or the economic criticism. The first contradiction to consider is how charming the Duke actually is. It would be tempting to suggest Browning wants to paint him as a vessel. But knowing the poet's love of language, it's clear that he wants us to admire a character who can manipulate language so masterfully. Further, the Duke shows an interest, an interesting complication in his attitudes on class when he suggests to the envoy that they go together down, an action not expected in such a hierarchical society. By no means can we justify the idea that the Duke is willing to transcend the class. But at the same time, he does allow a transgression of the very hierarchy that had previously led him to have his wife murdered rather than discuss his problem with her. The last thing to point out in the Duke's language is his use of euphemism. The way he explains that he had the Duchess killed and gave commands, then all the smile stops together, shows a facility for avoiding the truth through choice of language. What this could suggest is that the Duchess was in fact guilty of a greater transgression than he claims, that instead of flirtation, she might have physically or sexually betrayed him. There is certainly no explicit evidence of this, but at the same time, it's plausible that a man as arrogant as the Duke, especially one so equipped with the power of euphemism, would avoid spelling out his disgrace to a lovely envoy and instead would speak around the issue. Finally, one can also understand this poem as a commentary on the art. The Duke remains enamored with the women he has had killed, though his affection now rests on the representation of her. In other words, he has chosen to love the ideal image of her rather than the reality, similar to how the narrator of the Porphyrian lovers chose a static, dead love than the one destined to change in those of life. In many ways, this is the artist's dilemma, which Browning explores in all of his works. As a poet, he attempts to capture contradiction and moments, psychological complexities that cannot be pinned down into one object. And yet, in the end, all he can create is a collection of the static lines. The Duke attempts to be an artist in his life, turning a walk down the hallway into the performance, but he is always hampered by the fact that the ideal that inspires his performance cannot change. So, friends, we have understood the poem very critically, and we do not we need to remember that these are the major themes that we find in this entire poem written by Robert Browning. The themes of objectification of women, social status, art and elitism, control and the manipulation. These are several themes discussed by our poet in the poem. Thank you for watching this video. Keep learning. Stay happy.
स्वाध्यायः